The last dance at Cedar Lake. The call came at 6:12 in the morning, the kind of hour when nothing good ever happens. Linda Harper stood in the frozen food aisle at Miller's Grocery, staring at a box of lasagna she didn't even want, when her phone began to vibrate in her hand. The number on the screen was unfamiliar, and for a moment she considered letting it ring. At 63, she had learned that most unexpected calls carried bad news. She answered anyway. "Mrs. Harper?" a soft voice asked. "This is St. Matthew's Hospital. I'm very sorry. Your husband passed away this morning." Linda didn't cry right away. The words landed slowly, like snow settling on a quiet street. Robert had been fading for years, lost in the fog of Alzheimer's long before his heart finally gave out. Still, hearing it spoken aloud felt like a door closing somewhere deep inside her. She thanked the nurse, hung up, and placed the lasagna back in the freezer. The world around her moved normally. Carts rolling, children laughing, an old country song playing through the speakers, but something in her chest felt hollow. She walked to her car without remembering how she got there. What she didn't know yet was that Robert had left behind more than memories. He had left a letter, and that letter would lead her back to a man she had once loved so fiercely that even 40 years of marriage couldn't completely erase him. Linda's house sat at the end of Maple Street, a small white place with a wide porch Robert had painted every summer whether it needed it or not. When she opened the front door, silence greeted her like an old acquaintance. The recliner still faced the television. His slippers rested beside it. For months she had been preparing for this moment, telling herself she would feel relief when the long goodbye finally ended. Instead, she felt unfinished. The funeral passed in a blur of casseroles and quiet hugs. Emily flew in from Chicago with her 2 teenagers, moving through the house like a storm of energy Linda struggled to keep up with. Mark called from Texas, promising to visit soon, though work always seemed to pull him in another direction. When everyone left, Linda found the envelope waiting on the kitchen table, her name written in Robert's careful handwriting. She sat down slowly and opened it. "Linda," the letter began, "if you're reading this, then I finally remember enough to say goodbye the way you deserve. There's something I never told you, something I was afraid would take you away from me." Her breath caught. The next line changed everything. "There's a man named Daniel Reeves." The name felt like a stone dropped into still water, sending ripples through years she thought were settled. Daniel had been her first love, the boy who kissed her behind the high school gym and promised they would leave their small town together. He left for Vietnam instead, and never came back to her. Robert's letter continued. "I found his letters years ago. I kept them from you because I was afraid. I thought loving you meant protecting what we built. But before I go, I need you to know he's alive, and I think you should see him." An address was written at the bottom. Cedar Lake. Linda folded the letter carefully, unsure whether she felt anger, curiosity, or something far more dangerous, hope. The drive to Cedar Lake felt longer than she remembered. The road curved through pine trees and past quiet farms. The sky stretched wide and gray above her. She told herself she was just delivering closure, nothing more. But her hands tightened on the steering wheel as the lake came into view, reflecting the pale winter light. The cabin stood near the water, smoke curling from the chimney. She hesitated before knocking. The door opened before her hand touched the wood. Daniel Reeves looked older, thinner, his hair streaked with silver, but his eyes were the same. Steady, searching, familiar. For a moment neither of them spoke. "I didn't know if you'd come," he said finally. Linda swallowed. "I almost didn't." They sat at a small wooden table overlooking the frozen lake, coffee steaming between them. Conversation came slowly at first, like learning a language they once spoke fluently but had forgotten through years of silence. Daniel listened when she talked about Robert, about the long illness and the quiet strength it took to care for someone who slowly forgot the life you shared. Linda listened when he spoke about the war, about nights he couldn't sleep, about returning home feeling like a stranger to his own memories. Then he handed her a box. Inside were dozens of envelopes addressed to her, all unopened. "I wrote for years," he said quietly, "but they kept coming back. Linda's heart pounded. She had never moved. Someone had stopped those letters. And tucked inside the final envelope was a note in Robert's handwriting. Linda stared at the words, feeling the past shift beneath her. "I thought it was best for you," Robert had written. She felt anger rise, sharp and unexpected, but it tangled with grief before it could fully take shape. Robert had loved her. She knew that. Yet he had taken something from her she never realized she lost. The chance to choose. Daniel watched her carefully. "I never stopped wondering what would have happened if you'd answered," he said softly. Linda didn't know how to respond. Outside, the lake remained still, frozen under a sky that promised change. And for the first time since Robert's death, she felt something stir inside her that wasn't only sadness. It was possibility. What she discovered next would change everything she believed about loyalty, forgiveness, and the strange way love finds its way back when life feels almost finished. Linda stayed at the cabin long after the coffee had gone cold. Robert's words lay between her and Daniel, invisible but heavy. She wanted to feel angry, but instead she felt something more complicated. A quiet understanding she hadn't expected. For the first time, she saw her late husband not only as the man who had loved her, but as someone who had been deeply afraid of losing her. "I didn't know," Daniel said softly, looking at the stack of envelopes. "If I had, I would have stopped writing." "No," she replied, surprising herself with how steady her voice sounded. "You shouldn't have stopped. I should have had the choice." The sentence hung in the air, not an accusation, just a truth neither of them could change. They stepped outside onto the porch. The lake was frozen, but beneath the ice she could hear faint cracks, a reminder that winter never lasted forever. "Were you happy?" Daniel asked carefully. Linda thought about it. "Yes," she said after a long pause. "But not in the way I imagined when I was young. With Robert, life was steady, safe. He was a good man. And I ruined that," Daniel murmured. She shook her head gently. "No, life just went a different way." Back home, the silence felt different now. Less empty, more unfinished. Linda spread the letters across the kitchen table and began reading them one by one. Each envelope held something simple. A description of a storm by the lake, a memory from high school, a photograph of a cabin slowly being built. Daniel never wrote dramatic confessions of love. Instead, he wrote about ordinary days, as if hoping she would be part of them someday. She read until midnight, and with every page, she felt the weight of years she had never known existed. The next morning, Emily arrived unexpectedly. She stepped into the kitchen, arms full of groceries, and immediately noticed the letters. "What's all this?" she asked. Linda hesitated for only a second. "It's from someone I knew a long time ago," she said quietly. "I went to Cedar Lake. I saw Daniel." Emily froze. "Mom, that's fast." "It's not about moving fast," Linda replied. "It's about finally understanding the truth." She explained about Robert's letter, about the intercepted mail, about the decades of silence she had never chosen. Emily listened, but her expression remained tense. "I just don't want you to make decisions you'll regret," she said. Linda looked at her daughter gently. "I already regret not knowing sooner." That evening, Linda drove back to Cedar Lake again without planning to. The road felt familiar now, almost comforting. Daniel was waiting on the porch, as if he sensed she would return. They walked along the shoreline, talking more easily than before. Memories turned into laughter. Stories about school dances, about summer nights that once felt endless. "You know," Daniel said, "I always thought feelings faded with age." "And?" she asked with a small smile. "They don't fade," he said quietly. "They just become honest." Warmth spread through her chest. Not the reckless spark of youth, but something steadier, deeper. Over the following weeks, she began spending more time there. They cooked together, watched old movies, and shared stories they had never been brave enough to tell decades ago. One night, Daniel grew unusually quiet as they sat by the fire. "There's something I need to tell you," he said finally. Her stomach tightened. My heart isn't doing well, he admitted. The doctors say I need to slow down. A lot. She stared at him. Why didn't you tell me before? Because I didn't want you to stay out of pity, he said gently. She reached for his hand. I'm not here because I feel sorry for you. That conversation forced her to face a fear she thought she had buried forever. After years of watching Robert fade away, she had promised herself she would never walk into another story that ended in loss. But something inside her had changed. She realized that avoiding love didn't protect her from grief. It only protected her from living. When she returned home that night, she sat alone in the kitchen, staring at an old photograph of herself and Robert on their wedding day. Instead of guilt, she felt gratitude, as if her past and present could exist without canceling each other out. Love wasn't a competition. It was a journey that changed shape over time. And somewhere ahead of her waited a decision that would test not only her courage, but her relationship with her daughter. What she would discover next would force her to rethink everything she believed about forgiveness. Linda didn't tell Emily how often she had started visiting Cedar Lake. Some truths felt too fragile to explain before they were fully understood. Instead, she moved through her days quietly. Mornings at home, afternoons by the lake, evenings reading letters she had missed for decades. Spring came slowly. Snow melted into thin streams that ran along the roadside, and the frozen surface of the lake began to crack and shift. Daniel seemed happier when the sunlight lasted longer. He moved more carefully now, but there was a calmness in him that Linda hadn't noticed during their first meeting. One afternoon, while they were sitting on the porch watching geese land on the water, he said something that lingered with her long after. You know what surprises me most? He asked. What? She said. That we're still capable of this, he replied, gesturing between them. After everything. After all the years. Linda didn't answer right away. She was thinking about Robert, about the last months of his life when conversations became shorter and silence filled the house. For a long time she believed that chapter had closed the part of her heart that could feel excitement again. But here she was, laughing, waiting for someone to pour another cup of coffee, planning tomorrow instead of just surviving today. Emily called that evening. How's the house? Her daughter asked casually. Quiet, Linda replied. And you? Emily added. Linda hesitated. I'm okay, she said. Emily paused. Are you still seeing him? The question wasn't angry this time, just cautious. Yes, Linda said honestly. A long silence followed. I don't know how to feel about that, Emily admitted. You don't have to decide anything right now, Linda said gently. I'm still figuring it out too. Emily sighed. I just miss Dad, she whispered. I do too, Linda replied, her voice soft. That was the truth that held everything together. Loving someone new didn't erase the love that came before. It simply made the heart larger, even when that expansion hurt. A few days later, Daniel asked Linda to help him sort through old boxes in the cabin's attic. Dust floated through the air as they opened containers filled with photographs, military medals, and faded postcards from places he had visited after the war. In one box, Linda found a small record player and a stack of vinyl records. She laughed softly. I remember this, she said, holding up a scratched album from the 70s. You used to play this song every summer. Daniel smiled. You always said it was too slow. Maybe I just didn't know how to slow down back then, she replied. They set the record player near the window and let the music fill the room. The sound was imperfect, a faint crackle between notes, but it felt real in a way modern silence never did. Without thinking, Daniel reached out his hand. She hesitated for only a second before taking it. They didn't dance the way they had when they were young. Their movements were slower, more careful. But there was something deeply grounding in that moment. A quiet promise that even after loss, life could still hold warmth. That night, after Linda returned home, she found another envelope tucked inside Robert's old desk drawer. She didn't remember seeing it before. Her name was written on the front. Her hands trembled as she opened it. Linda, the letter began. If you're reading this, it means you found your way back to a part of yourself I was always afraid of losing. I hope you're not angry anymore. Or if you are, I hope someday you understand." She sat down slowly. Robert wrote about the years when Daniel's letters arrived at the house, how he read them secretly, how he convinced himself he was protecting their marriage. He described nights when he almost gave them to her but couldn't find the courage. "I loved you enough to hold on," he wrote, "but I didn't know how to love you enough to let you choose." Tears slid down her face. The words didn't erase the pain, but they softened it. For the first time, she felt compassion for the fear that had shaped Robert's decisions. He hadn't been trying to control her. He had been trying to keep the life they built from falling apart. And near the end of the letter, he wrote something that stayed with her long after she folded the page. "If Daniel ever comes back into your life, don't let my mistakes stop you from being happy." Weeks passed. Linda began bringing Daniel into her daily routine: grocery trips, small dinners with friends, quiet afternoons at the park. Some people in town watched with curiosity, others with kindness. A few whispered, but she had reached an age where whispers mattered less than honesty. One afternoon at Rosie's diner, her friend Susan leaned across the table. "So, are you in love again?" she asked with a playful smile. Linda laughed nervously. "I don't know if love looks the same at 63, she said. Susan nodded knowingly. "It doesn't," she said. "It's better, because now you know exactly how fragile it is." The fragile truth became impossible to ignore when Daniel collapsed near the lake one evening. They had been walking slowly along the shoreline when he suddenly stopped, his hand tightening around hers. "I just need a minute," he said, trying to sound calm, but his breathing grew uneven. Linda's heart raced. Memories of hospital corridors flooded back, the beeping machines, the helpless waiting. She called for help, her voice shaking more than she wanted to admit. The ambulance lights reflected off the water as paramedics rushed toward them. Daniel tried to reassure her, but his voice sounded distant. At the hospital, doctors spoke in careful tones about his heart condition worsening. "He needs to slow down," one of them said gently. "Stress and isolation aren't helping." Linda sat beside his bed long after visiting hours ended. She realized then that this relationship wasn't just about rediscovering the past. It was about choosing whether she was brave enough to risk another goodbye. When Emily arrived at the hospital the next morning, tension filled the room. She looked from Linda to Daniel, then back again. "I didn't know it was this serious," she said quietly. Linda nodded. "I didn't want to worry you." Emily's eyes softened as she watched Daniel sleeping. "He looks kind," she said after a moment. "He is," Linda replied. Emily hesitated. "I'm still scared," she admitted. "But I see that you're alive again, and I haven't seen you like that in years." The words felt like a small bridge forming between them. Fragile, but real. That night, Linda sat alone in the hospital cafeteria, holding both of Robert's letters in her hands. She thought about the different kinds of love she had experienced: the steady partnership of marriage, the unfinished spark of first love, the complicated forgiveness that comes with understanding someone's fear too late. For years, she believed life after 60 meant closing doors quietly. Now she understood that sometimes it meant opening them again, even when you knew they wouldn't stay open forever. What she didn't realize yet was that Daniel had one more truth to share, and that truth would change how she saw both the past and the future waiting for her beyond Cedar Lake. Daniel was discharged from the hospital 3 days later. He moved slower now, and the doctors insisted on medication schedules Linda carefully wrote down on a yellow notepad. The drive back to Cedar Lake felt quieter than usual, as if both of them understood that something had shifted. The future no longer felt open-ended, felt measured not in years but in moments. They sat on the porch that evening watching the sun sink into the water. The lake shimmered under a pale orange sky, and for a long time neither of them spoke. "Linda," Daniel said finally, his voice low, "there's something I never told you about Robert." She turned toward him, surprised. "What do you mean?" He hesitated, searching for the right words. "A few years ago, before his memory got really bad. He came to see me. Linda felt her breath catch. He drove all the way out here, Daniel continued. I didn't even recognize him at first. He told me he had something to fix. She stared at him, trying to imagine Robert standing on this same porch. What did he say? She asked quietly. Daniel looked down at his hands. He apologized, he said, for keeping us apart. He told me he had read every letter I ever sent you. He said he thought he was protecting your marriage. But near the end he realized he might have taken something from you that wasn't his to take. Linda felt tears rise before she could stop them. He asked me not to come back into your life unless you were ready, Daniel added. He said you deserved peace, not confusion. The truth settled into her slowly. Robert hadn't only hidden the past, he had tried to repair it before he died. All those years she believed love meant choosing one path forever. Now she saw it differently. Love could change, could grow, could even correct its own mistakes. Over the following weeks, Daniel stayed at Linda's house more often. The guest room filled with his books and a few photographs from the cabin. At first the house felt unfamiliar with another presence again. The sound of footsteps at night, the quiet hum of conversation drifting through the kitchen. Emily visited more frequently now. She still watched everything carefully, but the sharp edge in her voice softened. One evening she sat with Daniel at the dining table, asking him about the war, about the places he had traveled afterward. You make my mom laugh, Emily said finally. Daniel smiled. She makes me feel like I didn't waste all those years, he replied. Emily nodded slowly, as if accepting something she had resisted before. One afternoon, Linda found herself sorting through Robert's old photo albums. She paused at a picture from their 30th anniversary. The two of them standing by the lake, smiling in a way that felt genuine and uncomplicated. She realized something important then. Her life hadn't been divided into right love and wrong love. It had simply been different chapters. Robert had given her stability, family, decades of shared memories. Daniel had returned to remind her that her heart was still capable of opening again. Both truths could exist without canceling each other. Spring turned into early summer. The backyard filled with the smell of fresh grass and distant barbecues from neighboring houses. One evening, Daniel asked if they could drive back to Cedar Lake together. I want to see it one more time, he said. They arrived just before sunset. The cabin looked smaller now, quieter, as if it had already begun to say goodbye. They walked slowly to the dock. The water moved gently beneath the boards, reflecting streaks of pink and gold across the surface. You know, Daniel said, I used to imagine growing old here alone. I thought that was the price for all the things I lost. And now? She asked. Now I don't feel alone anymore, he said softly. He reached for her hand. They stood there in silence until music drifted faintly from a nearby cabin. An old song from their youth, slow and familiar. Daniel laughed quietly. Remember when you said you hated slow songs? She smiled. I think I just didn't know how to listen back then. He pulled her gently into a dance. They moved slowly, carefully, the lake stretching endlessly around them. Linda felt time fold in on itself, past and present blending into something softer, kinder. It wasn't about reliving what they once had. It was about honoring what they had now. A few weeks later, Daniel's health began to decline again. He grew tired easily and spent more time resting in the backyard under the shade of the old maple tree. Linda stayed close, not out of obligation but out of quiet choice. One evening, as they watched fireflies blink across the grass, he turned to her. I don't regret coming back into your life, he said, even if it's only for a short while. She squeezed his hand. It's not about how long, she replied. It's about how honest it feels. He smiled faintly. That sounds like something you learned the hard way. She nodded. I did. Emily arrived one afternoon carrying a box of string lights. What's this for? Linda asked. For a small party, Emily said. You need something happy in this house. They hung the lights across the backyard fence. Mark flew in from Texas for the weekend, bringing laughter and stories that filled the space with warmth. Linda, hadn't felt in years. As dusk settled, music played softly from a speaker near the porch. Friends gathered with folding chairs and paper plates, sharing stories about Robert, about life, about the strange way time moved faster as they grew older. Daniel watched everything quietly, a gentle smile on his face. When the music slowed, he stood and held out his hand to Linda. "Dance with me," he said. She laughed nervously. "We're too old for that." He shook his head. "We're exactly old enough." They moved under the string lights, surrounded by people who understood that love didn't have an expiration date. Linda felt a deep sense of peace settle over her. Not the excitement of youth, but the calm knowledge that she had chosen courage instead of fear. Emily watched from the porch, tears in her eyes, finally understanding that her mother wasn't replacing the past. She was continuing it. Late that night, after everyone left, Linda and Daniel sat quietly in the backyard. "Do you think Robert would be angry?" she asked suddenly. Daniel looked at her gently. "No," he said. "I think he'd be relieved." She closed her eyes, letting the thought settle inside her. For years she believed moving forward meant leaving something behind. Now she realized it simply meant carrying everything with her. Memories, mistakes, forgiveness, and the fragile hope that life could still surprise her. What she didn't know yet was that the hardest goodbye was still ahead. And when it came, it would reshape her understanding of love one final time. Summer faded slowly, almost gently, as if the season itself understood that Linda needed more time. The days grew shorter, and the evenings carried a coolness that reminded her how quickly life could change. Daniel spent more hours resting on the porch swing, watching the sky shift from blue to pale gold. Sometimes they talked, sometimes they simply sat together, letting silence speak for them. Linda noticed the small changes first, how his laughter came less often, how his hands trembled when he reached for his coffee mug. She didn't say anything about it. After years of caring for Robert, she recognized the signs without needing words. One evening, Daniel asked her to walk with him to the edge of the yard. The grass brushed softly against their shoes as they moved slowly, step by step. "I've been thinking a lot lately," he said. "That sounds dangerous," she joked gently. He smiled, but his eyes were serious. "I spent most of my life believing I had missed my chance with you," he said. "And now, I realized this was never about getting back what we lost. It was about learning how to be present with what we still have." Linda felt her throat tighten. "You didn't come back too late," she said quietly. "Maybe not," he replied. "Maybe this is exactly when we were supposed to meet again, when we finally understood what love really means." A week later, Daniel's health declined rapidly. He grew weaker, needing help even with simple things like standing or walking to the kitchen. Linda moved a chair closer to the window so he could watch the neighborhood. Children riding bikes, neighbors watering their gardens, the ordinary rhythm of life continuing around them. Emily visited almost every day now. She brought homemade soup, adjusted pillows, and sometimes just sat quietly beside her mother, holding her hand. One afternoon, Emily turned to Linda and whispered, "I think I understand you now." Linda looked at her, surprised. "What do you mean?" "I thought loving someone again meant you were forgetting Dad," Emily said. "But watching you with Daniel, I see that it's not about replacing anyone. It's about not letting fear decide how you live." Linda felt tears fill her eyes. "Your father taught me how to stay," she said softly. "Daniel reminded me how to begin again." Emily smiled faintly, the tension that had lived between them for months finally dissolving. On a quiet Sunday morning, Daniel asked Linda to play one of the old records they had found in the attic months earlier. The familiar crackle filled the room as music drifted through the house. "Do you remember this one?" he asked. She laughed softly. "You used to play it every time we argued. Because it made you stop talking long enough to listen," he teased. She sat beside him, their hands resting together as the melody moved slowly around them. "Thank you for coming back into my life," he said. She shook her head. "Thank you for not giving up on it." They stayed like that for a long time, Not speaking, just sharing the quiet understanding that comes when two people know their time together is limited but meaningful. That night, as rain tapped gently against the windows, Daniel passed away peacefully in his sleep. Linda woke just before dawn, sensing the stillness before she even opened her eyes. She reached for his hand and felt both sorrow and gratitude wash through her at the same time. This goodbye felt different from the one she experienced with Robert. There was no unfinished conversation, no hidden truth left unspoken, only the deep, steady warmth of having chosen love again despite knowing it would eventually hurt. The memorial at Cedar Lake took place a week later. Friends gathered near the dock, bringing flowers and stories. Emily stood beside Linda, her arm wrapped gently around her shoulders. Mark flew in again, quieter this time, helping carry chairs and greet neighbors. Linda scattered wildflowers into the water, watching them drift slowly across the surface. She thought about the young girl she once was, the one who believed love had only one chance to exist. She thought about the woman she had become, someone who learned that the heart could grow wider, not smaller, after loss. As the sun dipped behind the trees, Emily squeezed her hand. "Are you going to be okay?" she asked. Linda looked out across the lake, feeling the breeze move gently around her. "Yes," she said softly, "because loving him didn't take anything away from me. It gave me something back." Months passed. Autumn arrived with golden leaves covering the sidewalks near her home. Linda returned to her routines. Mornings at Rosie's diner, walks through the park, quiet evenings on the porch with a cup of tea. But she no longer felt like she was simply waiting for time to pass. She began volunteering at a community center for widows and widowers, sharing stories with people who were just beginning the journey she had walked through twice. Sometimes she spoke about Robert, about loyalty and patience. Other times she spoke about Daniel, about courage and second chances. One evening, as she sat alone watching the sunset, she found herself smiling at a memory of the last dance under the string lights. The image felt less like a goodbye and more like a promise, proof that life could still hold beauty even after deep sorrow. Emily joined her on the porch. "I've been thinking," her daughter said. "Maybe love doesn't come once in a lifetime. Maybe it comes whenever we're brave enough to let it." Linda nodded. "That's exactly what I learned." A year later, Linda drove back to Cedar Lake alone. The cabin stood quiet, the dock stretching out over calm water. She walked slowly to the end and sat down, letting the silence wrap around her. She didn't feel empty. She felt full of memories, of lessons, of a strange peace she never expected to find after so much loss. She realized then that love after 60 wasn't about starting over from nothing. It was about carrying everything forward, every person, every mistake, every moment that shaped who she had become. As the sun dipped low, she whispered softly into the wind, "Thank you, not just to Daniel, not just to Robert, but to the life that taught her that endings weren't always the opposite of beginnings. Sometimes, they were the reason new chapters existed at all." Moral reflection. Life doesn't stop asking us to be brave just because we grow older. After loss, we're told to be careful with our hearts, to protect what remains. But sometimes the greatest courage isn't guarding the past. It's allowing yourself to feel again, to trust again, to love again, even when you know exactly how fragile it can be. Because love isn't measured by how long it lasts. It's measured by how fully you live while it's there. And sometimes the last dance becomes the one that teaches you how to keep moving long after the music fades.